In his telling of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16, was Jesus giving people insight into what happens immediately after death? There are a number of reasons to believe that this wasn't what Jesus was doing with the story. He was doing something quite different. For one thing, the general view of death in the Old Testament was that the dead really are dead and not conscious or alive somewhere else in a disembodied state. So that's why we find David, for example, in the Psalms, saying that in death there is no remembrance of God. In death, who shall acclaim God? He was lamenting the fact that it all ends at death. Daniel 12 is another example of where an angel, a messenger of God, is speaking to Daniel, telling him of a future time when many who sleep in the soil of the ground shall awake. So what happened in the intertestamental period, from the time the last prophet wrote until Jesus was on the scene, to change the view of death? We have the writings of Josephus, the first century historian, who was himself a Pharisee, who depicted for us what Pharisees generally believed about death. And it's very similar to what Jesus described in the setting of the story of Lazarus and the rich man, where there is a realm of the dead, where to which the dead descend, at which point they're taken either to the left or to the right by angels to receive either punishment or reward. And there's a gulf fixed between them. They can see each other, but they can't cross over to the other side. So if Jesus believed that the dead really are dead and not conscious, then why was he telling a story where it seems to imply the opposite, that the dead are in fact still conscious and still exist in some other form? I believe that what Jesus was doing with this story was satire. He was using the form of satire to make a point, or to make more than one point. I believe that the point he was making was a very harsh rebuke of the Pharisees for their love of money. Not just their love of money, but within the context of Israelite society in the first century, under Roman occupation. The average Israelite was living under extreme hardship. But there was this huge contrast between the way the average Israelite lived and the way the Pharisees lived. They lived very comfortable lives. They wore expensive clothing. Why was there this huge contrast? And how did the Pharisees maintain their righteousness in the eyes of the people, despite this obvious difference in the way they lived compared to how everyone else was living? So immediately before starting this story, two statements that are made are very, very, very key in seeing the immediate context and the tension at that time between Jesus and the Pharisees. The story before Lazarus and the rich man was the story of the unjust steward. And after telling that story, Jesus gave a direct rebuke to the Pharisees, to their faces. He said that you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. What is high among men is an abomination in the sight of God. And then Luke, who's recording this series of stories in Luke 15 and 16, adds the following comment. He says, "Now the Pharisees who loved money heard all these things, and they derided Jesus. They derided him. Then there are 2 or 3 verses that follow, and then the story of Lazarus and the rich man begins. So that's the immediate context. It's got to do with the Pharisees' love of money. I don't believe that Jesus was making the general point that it's wrong to love money and you might end up in hell if you love money too much. I believe that the context within Israelite society was that the Pharisees were leaders in Israel, and under Mosaic law, they didn't have the option of turning away someone who was in real financial need in Israel. If a widow, for example, came to them for financial assistance and she really was in need, they couldn't turn her away. They had to come up with a way to help her, even if it meant parting with some of their own money. But they couldn't bear to do that. In Mark 7, Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for coming up with ways to interpret the law in such a way that they could avoid having to assist their own parents when they were in need. And that's what he was doing in Mark 7. It's very interesting. So what creative ways would they have come up with to avoid having to part with their money when a stranger came to them for help? So the context is not just about the love of money, but the love of money specifically when you are a leader in Israel and the duty lies upon you to obey the law of Moses and to help your fellow Israelites when they're really in need. So that's what Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees for. So a definition of satire is the use of humor, irony, ridicule, sometimes exaggeration, sometimes sarcasm, to criticize and expose people's vices or stupidity. And it's often within the context of contemporary political ideologies. And I believe that's what Jesus was doing with the story. I think the most important line in this whole story in Luke 16 is the words that Jesus puts in Abraham's mouth. Remember, the rich man had died. He'd gone to Hades. He'd been taken to a bad part of Hades. The poor man dies and goes to Abraham's bosom. So when the rich man calls out to Abraham from the other side of the gulf that's fixed between the two, the rich man calls out to Abraham and says, "Father Abraham, please send Lazarus to give me some comfort by dipping his finger in water and dropping it on my tongue, for I'm tormented in this flame." What does Abraham say in response? I think this is the most important thing to note about the whole story. What he says is, it makes no sense and it's ridiculous. And this is part of the method of satire. And this is what Abraham says is absurd. He says to the rich man, "Son, remember that you had your good things in life, and Lazarus likewise had evil things. Now he is comforted, yet you are in pain." And then he goes on to say, "By the way, there's a chasm fixed between us, and I can't cross over to you. You can't cross over to me. Just by the way, so even if I wanted to help you, I couldn't." But think of how absurd Abraham's statement is. He says, you had a good life. Lazarus had a terrible life. Now the roles are reversed. it's only fair. It's, in a sense, it's like he's saying, what did you expect? This is how it works in death. If you've had a very poor life of poverty and destitution, you're going to get reward. And if you've had a life of excess, you're going to receive the opposite after death. So why did Abraham make this absurd statement, and where does this thinking come from? This logic of a reversal of fortunes after death. I'm going to suggest that where this logic came from was from the Pharisees themselves, who had come up with a creative way to avoid having to part with their money to assist people who came to them for help. They would tell them that endurance of poverty was a virtue that would be rewarded in the afterlife. That if you find yourself in a position of poverty, it's God's will. It might be God's judgment on your life for something you did or something your parents or their parents did, and that one should endure it, however long it lasts. If it lasts throughout your life, then so be it. But you should endure your poverty, and that you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. You'll get the opposite in the afterlife. I believe that this was an excuse that the Pharisees had come up with. Again, a personal interpretation of the law. It actually made up a tradition to conveniently get out of having to part with their money, which they loved above all else. What the hell, boy? What's wrong? Are you scared? So Jesus was taking their teaching, or their tradition, and taking it to its logical conclusion. That, if the poor are going to have it good in the afterlife, almost as a given, then the rich will have the opposite of excess, or the opposite of comfort in the afterlife. They'll be in pain. And looking at Abraham's statement, isn't that what Abraham is implying? As absurd as it sounds, he's saying that don't you remember, you had good things in life, and Lazarus had evil things. Now it's reversed. And he says nothing more than that as an explanation of why it's fair that the rich man is in the bad part of Hades. I think the important thing to note is that because Jesus was using, in this satirical account, he was using the Pharisees' own views of the afterlife as a framework for the story that he created. It's important to note that nothing within this story should be taken as Jesus' own personal views on what happens after death. Not even the existence of a realm of the dead. We don't have to believe that there's a realm to which people go after death because of the fact that Jesus told the story. When you recognize that it is satire and not, well, it's not even a parable. It's just satire. It's completely made up. And the fact that he used a setting as a framework that was familiar to the Pharisees and familiar to probably many of the people in the audience is just a helpful way of having a familiar framework in which the story plays out. So I think one point Jesus made was he was rebuking the Pharisees for their traditions in trying to get out of observing the law of Moses regarding the requirement on them to assist the poor in Israel. And they were doing this while attempting to maintain righteousness in the eyes of the people. That's the other thing. So they were really being hypocrites. The other point Jesus was making was that, so the dialogue that follows from after Abraham's statement is that the rich man asks Abraham to send Lazarus back from the dead to warn his 5 brothers. And Abraham says, they have Moses and the law, let them hear them. Moses and the prophets, sorry. And the rich man says, no, but if one comes back from the dead, then they'll definitely believe. And Abraham says, no. If they don't believe Moses and the prophets, they won't believe, even if someone comes back from the dead. So this was obviously Jesus rebuking the Pharisees for their lack of faith, and in a way confirms that Jesus knew already that even after his resurrection they wouldn't believe that he was the Messiah. So it was a real lack of faith on their part. So those are my views on Lazarus and the rich man. I might do another video because there's quite a lot that can be said about this story. It's very interesting, and it's a very influential piece of scripture. If you do a search on YouTube, if you just type in Lazarus and the rich man, you'll see how many videos there are. Many of them with pictures showing people burning in hell, which I believe shows how people commonly think of the story, and I think it's a very superficial, surface level understanding of this story to think that Jesus was really pulling back the veil and showing us what it's like after death. It's a bit ridiculous because, for one thing, nowhere in the story of Lazarus and the rich man does Jesus actually say what it is that the rich man did to deserve eternal punishment. Is it because he didn't help the beggar at his gate? That sounds a bit ridiculous. And see if you can find somewhere else in the story where Jesus actually says, I've actually heard some well-respected Bible teachers say that this is about the love of money, and if you love money a little bit too much and you become a little bit too greedy, then you risk suffering eternal punishment. I think that's ridiculous. There's a lot more to this story, and if you recognize it as satire, you'll actually see how clever and how brilliant it was. I don't think Jesus came up with this story on the spur of the moment. I think he'd spent a while designing it. It's quite brilliant.